Hey guys, today in the shop we're going to be installing the IPR oil cooler with the full flow coolant filter on the shop truck. You're not going to want to miss this. Stay tuned. So we got the shop truck in today, and what we're going to be doing is installing the IPR remote mount oil cooler and the full flow coolant filter system. This particular video is going to be the shortened version of the full install. So as we speak, I'm producing two videos. I got the long full length version. I'm going to put a link here and also down in the description below. And that's going to be from draining the coolant all the way right till the very end. So if you're not comfortable with removing your intake manifold, you're going to want to click on that one and start from there. If you're comfortable removing your intake manifold, this video is going to focus on just the install of the IPR stuff itself. So we're already at the stage where the intake manifold is out. The oil cooler is still bolted into the motor, but we're going to pull the oil cooler out, disassemble that, and then start to install the IPR stuff, and then we're going to go from there. So if that's where you're at, stay tuned. So before we get into it, I just want to talk about a few of the reasons why you might want to do an oil cooler kit like this. Obviously, it's significantly more expensive than just doing a factory oil cooler, but you got to do the benefit versus cost, you know? So on something like this, you get the benefit of the oil cooler is no longer in the valley. That's nice for serviceability. If you ever have an issue, it's right there next to the battery, very easy to change, very easy to access. Another reason is it allows you to use a full flow coolant filter. This means that every single bit of coolant that would normally go through your oil cooler gets filtered first. As you know, the factory coolers plug up, and that causes EGR cooler failure. It causes elevated engine oil temperatures. So there's really no good way to prevent those coolers from plugging up when they're in the factory location. IPR does make a coolant filter kit that you can use, and there's some other filter kits that are only a bypass setup. But the real way to do it, get that cooler out of the valley and get it relocated, and then get a full flow coolant filter. This kit's nice. It uses the 6.7 oil cooler, which is a little bit better of an oil cooler than the 6 liter. Obviously, it's from 11 to 16 is where the oil cooler came out of, so they made some design improvements. And then the other option to look at is there are a few, air to oil coolers out there, but the problem is they have a hard time regulating the oil temperature. So when you're using air to cool your oil, it's very dependent on the outside air temperature. So if you have a really cold day, the oil has a hard time getting up to temperature. If you have a really hot day, then obviously you have hot air blowing across your heat exchanger, and the temperature is going to be elevated. The cooling system in a 6 liter, believe it or not, is really efficient. You have a nice big radiator, you have the thermostat system, and you have a nice electric fan setup. So the benefit of that is you're using your coolant to regulate the oil temperature. There's a reason they designed it that way from the factory. If the factory cooler didn't plug up, it actually is a really good system and does a really great job at keeping your oil temperatures in check. But unfortunately, they plug up, the coolers lose efficiency, and you got to replace them. So to me, if you have the extra money to spend, a kit like this is absolutely worth its weight in gold. Additionally, according to IPR, the tests they've done have shown that the liquid to oil cooling really shines during like a towing situation. In these situations, you have typically reduced travel speeds with elevated engine oil temperatures, and what's happened is you're putting a large load on the vehicle and you're seeing less airflow across the radiator. So the radiators in these trucks are really efficient. The fans are really efficient. But now if you use an air to oil cooler, you're really depending on the incoming airflow to keep that cooler cool. The truck does a pretty good job of maintaining its cooling system temperature. Like I said, this is why from the factory they chose to use an oil to coolant type of cooler. It's just the more efficient way to go. So like I said, this can help in both uphill, long climbs, slow speeds, heavy load, and then also on the deceleration where you have the same increased engine RPM, increased load, and reduced airflow. All these situations is where a oil to liquid cooler really shines. So at this point, what I like to do is I like to stick the turbo drain back into the oil cooler just so you don't get any debris go down inside there, and then just clean this all out, all around the oil cooler. You can see, I don't know if you can see on video, but this one is completely full of nuts. Looks like maybe there was a squirrel or a mouse living in this one or something. Truck did sit for a while, but just really take your time, use a shop vac, then blow gun, and make sure everything all around the oil cooler and the high pressure pump cover and everything is just spotless. Clean it up as best you can. If you pull this oil cooler out and there's still debris around it, all that debris will fall into the high pressure pump reservoir. So you want to make sure you get this as clean as you possibly can before you start taking off the oil cooler. Or if you were in here doing a high pressure pump, same thing. You don't want to pull that high pressure pump cover off and have all this debris fall in there. So I'm going to cut to this. I'm just going to get this all cleaned out, and then I'll see you in a few minutes for taking the oil cooler out and a few ways to prevent making a mess. Once it's all cleaned out, then what I do is I usually put a rag right across the back between the oil cooler and the high pressure pump cover. And what that does is when you pull this oil cooler up out of here, the reservoir is pretty full, so it ends up running down the back of the motor, and this just kind of prevents you having to clean the whole bell housing up and all that. So I just put a rag there, let that kind of absorb, and then you can take the 10 millimeter bolts that go all the way around the base of the oil cooler. Once those bolts are out, pick the oil cooler up and then just turn it 90 degrees, and then you can kind of rest it back on top of the engine, but the oil cooler dangling down itself keeps it up, and then it just kind of lets it drip. Then what I do is I grab an absorbent mat, I put it kind of like right next to the motor, and then I just pick the oil cooler assembly right up, put it on top, and just kind of carry it away. Now, one thing I want to tell you right now, do not use any kind of red rags, shop rags, or even an absorbent mat like this to clean out that high pressure oil pump reservoir, the reservoir under the oil cooler. If you do, all of the lint from that will either clog up the screen or make it past the screen and clog up your IPR. Once again, do not use any kind of red rags, anything like that to clean out this housing. So I try to keep these absorbent mats as far away from that opening as possible. Any kind of lint, any kind of debris, you want to keep it out of there. All right, so now that we get this cooler assembly out and on the bench, what you're going to want to do is start to disassemble it. So you're going to need a T30 Torx bit and a T45 Torx bit. And you'll see there's a bunch of Torx bits on the top, small T30s, and also the T45s. Now, a little piece of advice, depending on how gummed up your truck is, some of these is not a big deal, some of them you'll be really bad, but just try to clean out the holes for the Torx bits first. I usually use like a little pick. Just that way you can get your Torx adapter, your Torx bit all the way down inside the hole, because if you don't, it'll strip out the drive on it. So just clean it all up, take all those Torx bolts out, and then we'll pop it apart. After you get all the bolts off, you can start taking this whole cooler assembly apart. So sometimes this stuff's a little stuck on here. The first thing you want to do is pop off this little cover. This you don't need this anymore, so you can actually put that to the side. And then the little adapter where the EGR cooler goes in, this is usually a little stuck on the O-rings, so you might need 2 pry bars, kind of work it back and forth, and eventually it'll come off. But if it's original, like this one probably is, it's going to fight you a little bit, so just keep wiggling it. Eventually it'll come off. Then you can pry this top cover off. Put that to the side. So all that's left holding this together is two 13mm nuts on the top, and then directly underneath there's two 13mm bolts that go up through the cooler. And you'll be able to tell which side they are because it's the side that has these two little nubs right here. Be cautious. If you turn this thing upside down, make sure you have a bucket because the oil cooler is full of oil and full of coolant. So if you flip it completely upside down and take those bolts off, it's going to make a mess unless you have something to clean it up. I usually just take the two top off, and then I just kind of lift it up and go blindly underneath with the gun and take those two out. But if you need to, just flip it over, put it in a bucket. It's not really a big deal. The kit provides you with two new bolts, the ones that go up through the bottom. These are too short. You don't want to use these. They're not going to be long enough. So you can discard these with that other smaller top cover. Just put it aside. I say discard, but stuff like this I never like to throw away. You never know when you need it again. So at this stage, I like to put an absorbent mat down under the oil cooler so I don't make a huge mess in my bench. And it's pretty simple to get this thing popped apart. What I usually do is I take two pieces of wood, 2x4s, whatever you got kicking around, and put them under the edges of the oil cooler. Then all you need is a hammer and a socket you really don't care much about. And what you're going to do is the little spout that sticks up, you're going to hit on that with the hammer, and then the other round one right here where it comes through, use a socket. Now you need to make sure the socket is a smaller diameter than the cooler housing itself, but also still fits over the cooler. So you just put that socket on there and give it a couple of whacks, and then same thing back here, back and forth. Then the cooler drops right out. Take this and throw it in the trash. After you drain it, of course. Now just take all the old O-rings out. They all got to go. The bottom ones, you'll usually tell if it's been in here for a while, all these gaskets underneath are pretty flattened out. Pretty big cause of oil leaks that leak down into the valley and down the backside of the motor is all these gaskets being flattened right out. Take them all out of there. Flip the housing over. And there's a couple of O-rings that go, they actually stuck to this cooler as I pulled it out. There's a couple of O-rings that go in the housing right there. Then there's a small one here where the bolt passes through. Now, this is an early style housing. If you have a later style housing, there's actually a little bung that goes in that allows the bolt to thread in. And you got to push that out. There's an O-ring on that. I actually have another cooler that I'll show you on in a minute, another housing I'll show you on in a minute, but you got to push that little thing out, change the O-ring on there, otherwise you can have leaks there too. All right, so we got this all disassembled, ready to go. All you got to do is clean this thing up. If you got a parts washer, do that, one of those steam cleaners, whatever you got to do to get this stuff as clean as possible. I'm going to use a little bit of the power of movie magic, and I'm going to get these things clean. So 3, 2, 1. That was easy. So this is actually a newer style housing. I had another oil cooler setup kicking around, so I just kind of pre-cleaned it, make this job go a little smoother. So this is the piece I was talking about. You can see it has a little hex head on it right there. And then on the top, you can see it pokes through. And it's the only piece on here that's made out of steel besides this. Well, actually, this is brass, but it's the only piece that's made out of steel. So if you just take the handle of your hammer and just pop it through, you can see there's a little O-ring on this. You got to make sure you change that O-ring. Like I said, that can be a cause of an issue. And now we can start reassembling all this. So there's an O-ring that goes around this piece in the kit. The kit comes with all the O-rings you should need. So I like to get this one done out of the way before I forget. And I usually just I take like a brake cleaner can and I put a little bit of fresh oil in it, a cap for a can, I should say. Put a little fresh oil in it, and that's what I use to lubricate the O-rings. Some people use grease. I just like to use some good old 1540. And you can just take this, put it back in its hole, and pop it right in. And then there's going to be a couple of O-rings that go on the bottom. They either got stuck to your cooler or you had to pull them out. So there's a small one, goes in there. And then there's going to be two larger diameter O-rings that go in. And then this piece right here has the two bolt holes that go through it and then the one nut from the top. So you're going to install this in, push it in nice and gentle, make sure that all your O-rings are seated all the way, and you can get the two bolts here started, and then you can flip it over and then get the one nut in the middle started. Keep in mind, this is where you're going to use those two longer bolts that come with the kit. Very important. The other ones might reach, but they're only going to grab one or two threads, and not a very good situation. On the top side, it just uses one of the factory nuts that you took off. After you get those hand tight, you're going to want to torque the bottom bolts to 16 foot-pounds. Then you can install the O-rings onto the other crossover. So pay close attention. There's two different size O-rings. There's a smaller one and a bigger one. You'll see the lands where they go. The one closest to the housing, closest to the bottom is the larger O-ring, and the top one is the smaller O-ring. Just put them on nice and easy. Make sure not to cut anything. I like to use my fingers to put them on and no tools. Then use some motor oil and lubricate those O-rings. Now you can take this and you'll see the stud is kind of offset. You really can't put this in the wrong way. The stud doesn't line up with the hole if you have it the wrong direction, so it can really only go in one way. I like to put it in and just press, and you'll feel the O-rings kind of pop in. It's definitely going to take a little bit of force, and it's not fun. Sometimes it can be tricky. Then you can flip it over, then use that last factory nut, Get that started, and then torque both of these nuts to 16 foot-pounds. Now you can install the rest of the gaskets into the housing. Just make sure they're seated all the way in. There's little nubs all the way where the gasket sticks into, and if you don't push them all the way in, when you flip it over, the gasket tends to want to fall out on you. So just make sure it's in all the grooves nice, seated in properly. When you turn it upside down, the gasket shouldn't fall out. Then you can rest that right on the oil cooler assembly. Then you can take this housing, it's where the little EGR cooler hose goes onto, and same thing, takes a little bit of force, but just push that down. Then you can install all the bolts, the T30s and the T45s, except for this right now. I'm going to talk about that in a second. But just go ahead and get all the bolts that hold these in and torque them down. All the T45 bolts are 16 foot-pounds, and all of the T30 bolts are 7 foot-pounds. So now with the 2 remaining torque spits, you can install this little manifold. Now, very important here, it does come pre-installed, but you want to make sure that the outside O-ring is here and then also the inside O-ring. If those O-rings aren't both there, this can bypass and then you have some issues. So just check, verify, make sure that both of those O-rings are in place before you put this on, and then you can install it, and then same thing, torque it down to 7 foot-pounds. All right, so now just make sure to install the actual gasket that seals the cooler to the block. And then you're ready to install. So one other thing I want to talk about before we install this is this stainless screen that IPR makes. So the screen that goes underneath the oil cooler and feeds to the high pressure oil pump is made out of like a really poorly designed plastic screen that just deteriorates. Especially as time goes on, the engines get lots of heat cycles, the screen actually can blow through. When that happens, you have nothing stopping debris from going to your high pressure oil pump, which in turn goes to your IPR and also your injectors. So IPR research came out with this screen, and what it is double layers of a stainless steel mesh. It's all metal construction. There's really no way for this thing to fail, at least no way that I can see. So this is the last line of defense before your high pressure oil system. It's a really great idea, even if you're not doing this kit, even if you're just doing a factory oil cooler install, to call up IPR, get one of these screens. It's definitely saved quite a few IPRs in my career. So at least grab one of these. Make sure that that oil filter, that oil cooler reservoir underneath there is nice and clean. Pop this screen in, and then you're ready to put your oil cooler in. So now you can install the screen. Install the cooler housing assembly. Install the 10 bolts holding it down. And then torque them to 16 foot-pounds. All right, so now you can install your EGR cooler, install your intake manifold, turbo pedestal, turbo, all that stuff, get it in the truck, and then once that's in, I'll show you how to go about the next steps of installing the cooler, how to mount it, how to plumb it, and then we'll go from there. So now that you have the turbo back in, you can start working on the kit again. So first step is to install the 2 hoses that come from the manifold that you put onto the EGR cooler housing. Follow the instructions pretty closely because depending on if you're using their Gen 3 kit or if you're just doing the oil cooler kit, there's going to be different length hoses. This particular one is 36 inches for the back hose and 33 inches for the front hose. Make sure you orient the clamps the right direction so you can easily service them later on. Now you can install the new oil filter standpipe and bolt it down. All right, now that all your accessories are back on, your intake plenum, fuel bowl, and oil filter housing, all that stuff is back together. Now we can actually start installing this kit. The rest of the cooler itself, the filter, and it starts off by put the oil filter in. Then start to make sure you lubricate the O-ring on the housing, and then start threading this in. Okay, so the letters IPR need to be parallel with the firewall. If they're not, you'll have issues with the fittings lining up. So there's a very specific way they want you to turn this. What you do is you loosen up these 3 bolts, which I've already done here. This one can actually be loosened up just a little bit more. You don't want to go too crazy. You just want to loosen them up enough so it can rotate. And then you want to turn the top until it's parallel with the firewall. Then what they want you to do is snug the bolts up just enough so it doesn't rotate. Then you can take a marker and just make a line so you know that the cap doesn't move. That way when you back it off, if it doesn't line up, you can twist it back. But next step is to back the entire cap off 1.5 turns. Then you torque the 3 set screws down to 8 foot-pounds. Then you can tighten the cap back into place. Next up, install the fittings. The straight fitting goes in the back. And the 45 up front. You want this 45 to face in the backwards direction. All right, so we're getting down to the real nitty-gritty of actually installing this oil cooler kit. So once you get that filter housing in, you get the coolant lines run over to the side here, the next step is going to be mounting the cooler itself. So what we're going to do is, I already took the bolts out, but there's 4 13mm bolts that hold the battery tray in. So you're going to want to take this out, and the reason why is there's a little tab here that you got to either bend down or cut off and deburr. Looking at it, the way that everything's run, I feel we're better off cutting this off, deburring it. If you're not comfortable with that, you can definitely bend it down, but I think getting this tab right out of the way is the best bet to go. So I'm just going to use my little Milwaukee cut-off wheel and just chop that piece right off, clean it up, and reinstall the battery tray. So once you get that tab cut off, now you can reinstall the battery tray. On the 2003 trucks, it already has a little bracket that you can mount the oil cooler right to. Some guys will cut this off, use the IPR bracket. You really don't need to. You can bolt the oil cooler right to these two mounting holes right here. If you have an 04 and up truck, you got to use the bracket that is provided with the kit. And what that does basically is it uses the 2 bolts underneath the battery tray. So you would, before you bolt the battery tray down, you can slide this under and then put the battery tray on top and then put the bolts through. But we don't need to use this bracket, so I'm going to put it aside. Take the oil cooler and mount it right up. One minor detail is this AC line right here may need to be bent out of the way just a little bit. Don't go crazy, just get it out of the way just enough so it's not chafing on anything, but you might just need to push that a little bit, one direction or another. Then you can mount the cooler and then put the nuts on the bottom. I would say at this point, it's a good idea to get at least the passenger side intercooler pipe in. I say that because you really want to make sure you route all these hoses with everything in mind. You don't want to route some of this stuff and then have things interfere, tie things in the wrong way, and then you're cutting off zip ties and everything. So just get these pipes, at least this side, reinstalled, and then we can run the lines for the cooler itself. Next, you want to mount the coolant filter itself. So it goes over here on the passenger side. Just loosely assemble the filter and the bracket and everything, and just take a nice little Sharpie and line it up, find a good spot so it clears everything. Mark the inner fender here, and then just pre-drill some holes. And once you get the holes pre-drilled, you can use the sheet metal screws that are supplied. Don't over tighten them. If you tighten those sheet metal screws too much, it just rips right out. So unbolt this back from the bracket, bolt the bracket up, then you can bolt the coolant filter up. All right, so now that you have the filter mounted, you can start hooking up all the hoses. So this kit comes with a coolant manifold that bolts onto the oil cooler housing that we saw earlier. And that can be used with a factory oil cooler or any of the J-tube style EGR deletes. And when you use that manifold, you run the 36-inch hose in the back, like we showed earlier, and that's the inlet. And the 34-inch hose on the front, that's the outlet. So basically, you're going to go with the short hose from the front of that manifold, and then you're going to run it up and over, and that's going to come down and into the coolant filter. So front hose on the manifold into the coolant filter. And then you're going to go out from the coolant filter into the top of the oil cooler. Then you go from the bottom of the oil cooler, that's the other hose, the 36-inch, which is the longer of the two, and that comes down and around and goes to the bottom of the oil cooler. So inlet front, down around to the coolant filter, out of the coolant filter, top of the oil cooler, and then from the oil cooler is the other hose that is the back of that manifold. Now, if you're running their Gen 3 EGR delete, it's going to be the opposite. So the back is going to be the outlet, and the front is going to be the inlet. And same thing, the hose lengths switch. So you would just run from the back over to the coolant filter, and then same thing, coolant filter to the oil cooler, and then from the front down to the bottom of the oil cooler. So IPR wants you to just put a little bit of oil or grease on the flares of these fittings. Just kind of makes installation a little easier. And then what you want to do is the longer of the two lines goes to the bottom fitting on the oil cooler. So get that down there and get that started. And then it goes to the back fitting on the cap, or the straight fitting. Then the shorter line goes to the top fitting on the oil cooler and the 45-degree fitting on the cap. So it's very important after you get all the hoses routed to take some of the extra heater hose that they provide with the kit and cut it open, cut it into sections, split it. Right down the middle, you can use a razor blade or a pair of snips and find all the spots that it seems to chafe, especially down here on this hard line near the AC evaporator. You just want to make sure that none of the lines, even the lines that you added, aren't chafing against each other. The last thing you want to do is have one of these lines chafe, wear through, cause issues, and leave you stranded. Especially when you're adding anything aftermarket, you always want to make sure that it doesn't interfere with any of the factory stuff, and also that your factory stuff doesn't interfere with the aftermarket stuff. So they give you extra hose in the kit for a reason. Take that, split it open, grab a couple of zip ties, and just wrap it around the hoses and just make sure it's nice and secure, and double check it all. So now the rest is pretty self-explanatory. The biggest thing I want to go over is just make sure that all the lines are secure, you don't have anything chafing. Spend some extra time going over everything that you touch with a fine-tooth comb, make sure everything's plugged in, electrical connectors and everything. There should be a little bit extra of the heater hose that comes with the kit. If you need to slice that open and use that to put on any of the lines to stop things from chafing, just spend an extra half hour, 45 minutes going over everything to make sure that you're not going to have any issues down the road. So then you can do things like put the degas bottle back in, the driver's side intercooler pipe, and then top it off with oil and top it off with coolant. What I suggest is fire this thing up, let it run for a little bit in the driveway, let it idle, don't drive it right away, and just observe it for leaks. It's definitely, when you have anything this far apart or when you're making any kind of major modification like this, just take your time, check over all of your work. It's not worth getting on the road and finding out that you just dumped, all your oil out on the ground and now you got a big mess and you got a tow on your hands. So really pay attention to that. After your kit's all installed, something you need to be doing is monitoring your engine oil temperature and engine coolant temperature. This is something you should be doing on these trucks regardless of what kind of cooler you have in there. But the engine oil temperature and engine coolant temperature having a spread delta is an indicator that the coolant filter is starting to clog up. So once you start seeing 13 to 20 degrees of delta on this, that's when you're going to want to start checking your coolant filter. So if you are starting to experience the difference in engine oil temperature and engine coolant temperature, you need to really make sure that you follow the cleaning procedure laid out by IPR. I will be making an additional video talking about exactly that, but make sure you follow those instructions and clean the coolant filter properly. You also should be doing a flow test before and after cleaning the filter. So I really hope this video helped you guys out. Whether you watch the long version or the short version, I'm going to have links in the descriptions to both videos, so you'll be able to go back and forth and reference what you need to do. This one was a big project, and I'm really excited with the way it came out. And I'm happy to have you guys hanging in here and watching it for me. If you watch the long version, it's long. This one was a lot of work to make, so I hope it paid off. I hope you guys really enjoy it. Like always, guys, if you did like this video, hit that like button. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe. I plan on doing a video shortly that shows exactly how to do an oil change on this IPR kit because there is a pretty specific procedure. And then I'm also going to go over cleaning the cooling filter. This cooling filter, I suggest driving around for a couple of 100 miles, cleaning it out right away. And then after that, you should be able to go every oil change, cleaning the oil filter out, the coolant filter out. And then if the coolant filter seems to be clean every oil change, you can start to stretch it out a little bit. Eventually, it will get the majority of that sediment out of the motor, but it may take some time. Some motors are worse than others. But keep an eye out for a video coming on that soon. And then next up, chassis work, lowering kit, and then we'll start on the body work. So once again, guys, thanks for watching In the Shop. Hey guys, today in the shop we're going to be try again. Hey guys, today in the shop we're going to be installing the IPR remote oil cooler setup with the... Come on. Hey guys, today in the shop we're going to be installing the IPR remote oil cooler setup with the full flow coolant filter